Hello, I'm Laura Sabattini, Principal Researcher in the Human Capital Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf, a book discussion series brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, I'm here with Lindsey Pollak to speak about her book, The Remix: How to Lead and Succeed in the Multigenerational Workplace. The Remix is a guide to the multigenerational workforce of today. The book uses research, case studies, and practical recommendations to help us move past stereotypes about different generations at work and toward increased understanding of how we can work together more effectively. Lindsey Pollak is a New York Times bestselling author, keynote speaker, and leading expert on the multigenerational workplace. She is the author of Becoming the Boss, New Rules for the Next Generation of Leaders, and Getting from College to Career, Your Essential Guide to Succeeding in the Real World. Lindsey advises both young professionals and the organizations that want to recruit, retain, and market to them. Lindsey, welcome to Off the Shelf.
Thank you so much for having me, Laura. Yes. It's great to be here.
That's great. So I wanted to start with just some background about your book. And first of all, how did you come up with the ideas? And it seems like the book, The Remix, builds on your previous work on multi-generational workforce. So more broadly, how did you become interested in the topic?
I think what you're really asking is, what is a multi-generational work expert and how do you become something like that? It is something that is not common. So my very first job was at workingwoman.com in the 90s, based on Working Woman magazine. And I was just always interested in career development, career advice. And I was very young. When that company went out of business, I started freelance writing and really trying to figure out my own career. And I wrote my first book, Getting from College to Career. I was blogging and just kind of freelancing and making a living. And I started speaking on college campuses. And for 6 years, I was an official trainer for LinkedIn. So I taught students how to use LinkedIn on campuses. And I kind of thought that was my business. I loved teaching college students. I liked being independent, traveling around to campuses. The book was doing well. And then this word millennial sort of exploded onto the scene around 2007, 2008, right around the election of Barack Obama and his campaign. And people started calling me, corporations, nonprofits, law firms, saying, we hear you speak to millennials, not just college students. Can you start telling us about them? And I jumped on the opportunity and kind of taught myself a little bit about the history of generations and why people were struggling so much. I'm a Gen Xer myself, so it seemed very different from what I went through. And I did that for about 10 years. And then around 2017, 2018, my clients, corporations, nonprofits, law firms, conferences started to say, okay, we get it. Millennials are here, but boomers aren't leaving, and people are working into their 70s and 80s and sometimes 90s. We now have 5 generations. The Gen Zs are coming along. Now what do we do? And I really saw that pivot from the questions I was receiving from clients, and that led me to the research for the Remix.
Yes. And the idea of Remix, too, I think it's original, it's new, it's a very good way of thinking about this multi-generational work. So what does the idea, can you tell us a little bit more about the title?
So when I was thinking about organizations that were really successful in managing across generations and communicating across generations, I kept trying to find a metaphor that made sense. And eventually, and I credit my editor, Hollis Heimbach, it was her idea, I kept talking about mixing. And she said, well, isn't it really remixing? Mm-hmm. And we kind of hit on that, and the word was great, and I loved it. But I started interviewing DJs and music producers to learn more about remixes, and I kind of went down that path, which was really fun. And what a lot of these DJs told me, and this is a little tip for anyone listening who DJs a party anytime soon, is that one of the great things about remixes and why they're so popular is a DJ said if you're DJing a party and there's an empty dance floor, a little trick is to play a remix, because the older people at the wedding or the party know the classic and recognize it and say, hey, I know that. I'm going to go dance. They feel included. They feel invited. And the younger people know the remix version and the modernized version, and they feel included and they go and dance. So that vision of people feeling like they recognize something and they feel included, and that brings us all together, felt like the right metaphor for this book. And so when I define the remix in a workplace context, I think a lot of people make the mistake of thinking there's some new third way of being that will solve everyone's issues. Yep. The reality is it's about mixing the best of the past and the best of the present and future to bring everybody together. Definitely. And that's the remix.
Definitely. No, that's a great concept. And I definitely want to get back to this idea of remixing and kind of getting the best out of people in the mix. The other concept, Joe, an idea that you describe in your book that I think is very relevant is about leadership. So I think that throughout your book, there's several places where, leadership comes up, and also how fast some of the requirements and expectations around leaders are changing, also because of the new generations, but more generally because of the changing workplace. So can you tell us a little bit more how the idea of leadership fits into the model of the remix?
Sure. Leadership is, I think, the entry point to this topic for a couple of reasons. One is one of the biggest changes, I think, over time is that in the, quote, older paradigm, you had to lead other people to be considered a leader. You had to have followers. And I think because of social media, because of more flat organizations, because of the democratization of media and content, everyone feels like they can be a leader, whether it's on social media, virtually, in real life at an organization. There's a concept some companies call leadership from every chair. So this idea that you don't have to be a boss or a manager to be a leader is very powerful. And I think that resonates with everybody because everyone wants to lead themselves and lead ideas that they care about. So I think that sort of growth of the leadership term is really powerful. And the second piece I would say is that leadership is a very personal concept as well. And I tried to walk that line of how do you be a remixer in your organization, but then how do you be a remixer personally? So for example, it's one thing to hire a multi-generational team, but it's also how do you personally have a multi-generational network of people around you? So I tried to apply it at the macro level of organizations, but also at the micro level. And frankly, as an author, the word leadership resonates with everybody. Mm-hmm. Everybody wants to feel like a leader. Everyone wants to improve their leadership. And I thought that was a really powerful way to approach it.
Yes. I really appreciated in how you talk about it in the book. And I think it also speaks to the influencing part. You mentioned the mentoring, cross-mentoring. So we can all learn from others. And I think that's a very good messaging around inclusion.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples in the book of remixing is mentoring, to use your example. Mentoring is great. There's nothing wrong with mentoring. We shouldn't get rid of it just because it's been around for a long time. But I think the remix here is reverse mentoring or co-mentoring, which is that relationship can go in both directions. And there's so many leaders today who very much tap into the junior people around them because they know that they have wisdom too. And I think, frankly, young people have always had wisdom. We just never bothered to ask. And so I think what's so valuable today is not that anything has changed fundamentally about people's ideas. It's just we now have a mechanism for asking about them. And I think reverse mentoring is one of them.
Yes, definitely. And another good point from your book is about how when we look at what people want from their work and their career, oftentimes generations want the same things in many ways. And this is really reinforcing some of the research that you see around flexibility, work-life, or having flexible career paths that you can take. So why do we keep noticing the differences between and among generations when there are so many similarities in your perspective?
Such a great way to frame the question, because a lot of people don't like talking about generations. I get a lot of criticism when I teach workshops or give speeches, and people say, how can you say that 80 million people born in the same 15-year period are the same, or why does generation matter? And I understand that argument. What I like to say is that we are far more alike than we are different as human beings, as workers, as anything. What's different generationally is the environment in which we are placed. So my expectations as a Gen Xer about who will be beside me at work, what the career path will look like, what technology will be on my desk when I walk into an office are very different from the technology that my 8-year-old daughter is going to expect when she walks in. The number of women in an organization, whether I'm going to get a pension. So it's not that we as individuals are fundamentally different. It's that the expectations of what things will be like are very, very different. And so you can't compare a 30-year-old today to a 30-year-old in 1950. It's not fair to do that. It doesn't mean we're not human beings. And one of the things I like to say about millennials in particular, they want work-life balance. They're so entitled. They want to be boss on day one. They're always addicted to their phones, is that a lot of the things millennials are known for wanting, like flexibility, work-life integration, faster advancement. I would have loved those things in the 90s, but that just wasn't available to entry-level people. I don't remember anyone talking about work-life balance unless you were a parent. So it's not that I wouldn't have wanted it. It's that that wasn't a conversation. An example I always give is about bosses needing to be better today, that there's more criticism about being a good boss. I had some terrible bosses, but I didn't have Glassdoor. I didn't have ratemyprofessor.com. I didn't have Twitter to say, this guy is terrible. You know, what's going on here? I didn't have 360 feedback. Those mechanisms didn't exist. So my choices were accept it or leave. And so the desire was the same, but the tools that were available to do anything about it were very, very different.
Definitely. And I think that speaks not only about age and multi-generational diversity, but about other types of diversity as well, to some extent. You know, how the landscape of work is changing. Expectations are different. Expectations of how leaders should manage their people are different. So that resonated quite a bit with me in my area of work as well.
Great. Glad to hear it.
Great. So we are going to take a very short break for some quick announcements, and we'll be back in just a minute to continue our conversation with Lindsey Pollak about her book, The Remix: How to Lead and Succeed in the Multigenerational Workplace.
Can you, your team, or your company benefit from insights such as the ones provided in this podcast? They are immediately available when you join the Conference Board, a membership-based think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Reaching across industries and geographies, we bring together our noted experts, senior executives from the world's largest companies, and nonpartisan practical research to help you address your most important business issues. Our membership packages are tailored to your organization's unique needs and budget. To learn more about our offerings, go to www.conferenceboard.org and click Join on the top bar to connect with one of our product specialists.
Hello, and welcome back to our discussion about the book, The Remix, with the author, Lindsey Pollak. Lindsey, we just spoke a little bit about the content of the book and many of the great themes that emerge. And I wanted to shift the focus a bit to recommendations. So many of our listeners are going to be either human capital leaders or leaders of teams, definitely many professionals as well. So I think all the different recommendations that you propose in your book can be very relevant to our listeners. Can you you speak about the rules for remixers? Are there some examples of things that you think people will find interesting or even surprising?
So the first rule for remixers is stop the generational shaming. And I could not be more passionate about this topic. Millennials are so deeply shamed and criticized. We blame them for spoiling paper napkins and the beer industry and, all of these things. And now there's the okay boomer meme where younger people are criticizing baby boomers. It is so destructive. And it is so common. I have a quotation from the 8th century BC of older people saying, society's ruined because of young people today. I'm a Gen Xer. I remember being called a slacker. We do this over and over and over again. And talking about a general diversity lens, the things we say about generations, we would never say about any other group. Would you, entitlement is the joke about millennials. I would never walk in and say, Asian American women are so entitled. I mean, we just don't do that. And somehow it seems to be acceptable, but it's so painful. And so when a lot of organizations say, we can't attract millennials, my first question is, are you welcoming them? Are you accepting them? Are you including them? Or are you making fun of them? Are you criticizing them? Stop. and think about and catch yourself whenever you do that. And I think we do it to ourselves. I know a lot of millennials who say, well, I'm just a millennial. No one's going to listen to me. And that's destructive too. So I think from an organizational level and an individual level, think of this as a diversity issue. To not look, a little gentle joking is fine, but the shaming is really destructive. And I see it absolutely everywhere. So that's rule number one.
Definitely. And have you had examples? Do you have examples? I know you do also consulting and you work with organizations and leaders. Are there things that you've seen that you believe are very effective in addressing this shaming, for example, as a solution?
One of the ways I suggest approaching it, and this is really a mindset shift, is to assume the best intentions. And I think what happens is, let's say an example is earbuds, right, or AirPods. So you have a young person in your office who comes in and puts on headphones, the minute he walks in the door. And there can be this tightening in the stomach where the manager says, oh, he's so entitled. He thinks it's okay to listen to music. He's not paying attention. He's not committed to the job. And you sort of have this whole dialogue in your head of, this person is not a good employee. This person is slacking off. I would never have done that when I was his age. And what I suggest is, what if you asked him why he's wearing the AirPods or the earbuds or the headphones? And the conversation is usually, Laura, why are you wearing the headphones? And what you'll say is, well, we're in this open office and I'm really trying to get my work done and be productive and it helps me concentrate. So that means your intentions were actually really good and I was interpreting them incorrectly. I just find it hard to believe with the vast majority of employees that anyone wakes up in the morning and says, how can I really irritate my boss today? How can I be the most inappropriate? I think that most people are trying to do the right thing, but they're doing it in a very different way. Mm-hmm. And so if we have these conversations, if we're explicit about our expectations, that could lead to a conversation of something like, well, we have clients in the office today and I really want everyone to be focused. So could you leave your headphones off in the morning and then really focus and plug in the afternoon? Or could you wear one in one ear and take the other one out? Or can we decide that this project you can listen to music and this one you can't? Yeah. It sort of assumes that everybody wants the same thing as opposed to this adversarial relationship. So it's really catching yourself and saying, why is this bothering me so much? And could there be a reason that this person is doing the behavior?
Definitely. And that's a great recommendation for people managers in general. We sometimes setting up those expectations up front really helps with a lot of potential miscommunications. And I can see how when you come, as you said, from different models and different expectations that apply to day-to-day work, it can be even more useful.
Another example, I was working with a law firm, and this law firm partner, in a totally shamey way, said, these young people today, they just can't write. Their writing is terrible. We were such better writers in our day. And I said, well, how are you managing that? That sounds like a problem. And he said, I tell them, write better. We've all had managers like this. This is, an age-old problem. And I said, well, I feel like we could do something more effective. And what he ended up doing was he collected 100 examples of what he defined as good writing. So it was email messages and memos and briefs and documents. And now, instead of saying to someone, Laura, write better, he can say, here's how I would like this writing to look. Here are some examples for you. One of my favorite quotations of all time is from Voltaire. Common sense is not so common. It's common sense to him what good writing is. That's not true for everybody. Yep. It's not common sense to a 75-year-old perhaps how to DM someone on Instagram. That's common sense to a 12-year-old. Yep. So you have to really redefine your terms and be very explicit about what your expectations are. And by the way, good managers have always done this. Yep. Good managers for all time are good managers of generational differences. It's just realizing that you have to be more explicit, realizing you have to be more empathetic. And I have someone, come up to me at every speech and say, I think I do these things. And I would say, you're probably a good manager. I don't think it's anything new. I think it's just paying more attention to all of these factors that make someone a very good manager of people.
Yes. And that also speaks to your previous example about reverse mentoring and how that can be a way to communicate also those expectations and fill some of the gaps.
Yeah, leadership by example, servant leadership, leadership as coach as opposed to command and control. These concepts have been around a long time, but I think they're more important than ever.
Yeah. Another interesting concept that I wanted to discuss today is that of perennial. This is someone it's an attitude, right? More than anything, someone that has always curious about growth and encourage connection and inclusion, being open to change. So how can you tell us a little bit more about this concept in the framework of the multi-generational workplace?
Yes. So the concept of perennial was created by a blogger and journalist named Gina Pell. Perennial is that you transcend the concept of generations. It doesn't mean that you try to be super hip and use, cool terminology when you're, older. What it means is that you keep with the times and that you change and adapt with the times. So one of the examples that Gina Pell gives that I think is helpful just in conceptualizing the idea is of Lorne Michaels, the creator of Saturday Night Live in the 1960s. He dresses like his age. He is his age, but he has kept up with the times of what people find amusing, which people need to be on the show. He, and certain choices have been good and certain choices have not, but the concept of keeping that show relevant decade after decade, generation after generation, I think is a really nice way to think about what a perennial can be. And so I aspire to be a perennial. It doesn't mean I'm going to be cool. I'm definitely not cool, but I try to keep up with what I need to keep up with. And I think really importantly, it also means you know your history, because I think a lot of young people, as much as it's important for those of us, in our 40s and older to learn what's new, I think it's very valuable for younger people to learn the history of their industry, the history of their organization, so that they can connect with and learn the lessons of previous generations. It goes both ways.
Yeah. So is there a way to teach people to maybe not being perennial, but to learn those perennial skills in terms of their attitude? Have you seen anything in your work of things that maybe organizations or leaders are doing that seem to encourage this type of attitude?
The best way I've heard it described is really simple, and I look to the people I think of as perennials, and it's curiosity. It's getting into the habit when you walk into a conference of introducing yourself to someone who's not like you. It is inclusion and diversity, I think, at its base. It's not, let me find the person in here who seems most like me and connect. It's, let me find the person here who is most different and engage in a conversation. It is putting yourself in events and rooms and situations where you might not be. And that could be generational. That could be race and ethnicity. That could be going to an affinity group or ERG, employee resource group meeting that is not your personal identity to go as an ally. That could be attending a meeting of a different functional department. That could be watching a TV show that is not your normal environment. Any way that you demonstrate curiosity, I think, is really powerful. I know one manager who said, and this is a form of reverse mentoring, I think, he said, every week I walk into my office and I ask the youngest person on my team to put a new app on my phone and show me how she uses it. How great is that as a simple way to say, I just want to see it. I just want to check it out. I want to know what's going on. And I think that's really powerful. I like to ask people what books they're reading, and to know that, 5 people have recommended the same history book is a really powerful way to know that that seems to be gaining steam. I should probably check that out. So it's just curiosity. And again, smart people have always done this. People who are interested in the world have always done this. I just think it's more important now than ever before because we're in such a diverse work environment.
Definitely. And I can see how it also forces you to continue to learn, right? So it reinforces the attitude by asking those questions. You are exposed to things that are new and new ways of doing things.
Lifelong learning, I think, is a great way to think about it.
Great. And the last theme for our conversation is about the communication gap. So one of the statistics that you cite in your book is that 81% of today's workers say that the primary difference between generations in the workplace is related to communication styles. And that's where a lot of the stereotypes come up, right? So can you tell us a little bit more about this statistic and how you addressed it in your book?
I think it's what you said earlier. I think 81% of all problems are probably related to communication, no matter who it is. And I think the reason, to be fair to all of us, is communication is so much more complicated. If you were in the workplace in 1940, You could type a letter, you could talk to someone, you could call them up. There were like 3 choices, and now there are 300 choices. There's so many different ways to communicate, and there are very few rules. And stereotypes are not true. I have so many millennials who say to me, can you please tell other generations that we do want to meet face to face? We do want to talk to humans. We don't just want to text. And so many older people who say, can you tell the young people they don't need to speak slowly and loudly to me just because I have gray hair? I love technology. So number 1, don't make assumptions. Number 2, I have the simplest fix ever. And again, good people have always done this, particularly good salespeople, which is just asking everyone you work with, what's the best way to communicate with you? Are you a morning person or an afternoon person? Are you in meetings all day on Fridays, so that's not the best time to reach you? It's getting in the habit as an employee of learning the style of your manager. Salespeople with clients always have known, this person likes to talk on the phone, this person doesn't. This person likes to meet for lunch, this person likes to play golf, right? And so Michael Watkins, the author of The First 90 Days, calls it the style conversation. It's just asking. And I think as a leader or a manager of people, it's an act of generosity to tell the people who report to you, this is how to communicate with me. This is the method I'd like you to use when you're running late. This is how I would like you to get in touch with the clients. Because if you say something like, get in touch with Bob, that could have 20 different interpretations. And technologies like Slack or instant messaging, there really aren't rules. And so if you want people to use those tools in a certain way, you really have to communicate that. It's a simple fix for a very complicated problem.
Definitely. And this also makes me think that it's also helpful from an organizational perspective to set those expectations around communication so that people know where to get the right information. It encourages transparency. So it's even beyond the individual interactions. It can be really helpful in the workplace as a strategy overall.
And you're starting to see that, right? You're seeing no meeting Mondays, right? Certain companies are doing stuff like that, or little habits on email like NRN, no reply necessary, that if you set those boundaries and rules, it actually gives people a lot more freedom of how to communicate with each other.
Yes, definitely. So you mentioned earlier about asking people what books they're reading. And so I'm going to turn that question to you. This is a podcast about books. And are there any resources or interesting books that you've read recently, either about the topic, that we've been discussing or any other topic that you think it's relevant to what we've been talking about today?
There's so many great books being written on all of this stuff. The one that I'm reading right now is called The End of Loyalty by Rick Wartzman. It's really a history of how we got here in terms of what people perceive their career paths to be. So, I always have these arguments with my dad, who was a public school teacher and retired with a pension, that I am not going to have a pension. And so you can't compare your experience to mine. I'm not going to work at the same company for 50 years and retire with a gold watch. And Rick Wartzman's book, The End of Loyalty, describes how that happened. And I think a lot of people blame technology. They blame automation. They blame millennials. He has a much broader, more research, nuanced picture of how this happened. And I think it's a really fascinating history of how we got to this place and some suggestions for what that means for the future. So that's my number 1 pick, but I'm always looking for good suggestions. So please send them my way.
Definitely. And this podcast often has some great recommendations. So thank you so much for your time, Lindsey, and for speaking with us about your book. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into the conversation. You can purchase the book, The Remix, How to Lead and Succeed in the Multigenerational Workplace, at any bookstore and online. For more information, you can also visit Lindsey's website at www.lindseypollak.com. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to Off the Shelf Book Discussion Series or to explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board. You can find the catalog by visiting our website at www.conferenceboard.org/podcasts. This is Laura Sabatini, and thank you again for joining us today.